Hey family, Ron Spears with GrownManStyle. This next interview is with a brother I met in men's Bible study at church, Brandon Brice. He is a political consultant, but he's also a black Republican and a conservative. So we're going to get into what is a black conservative, why it's so important for all voices to be included at the table, and more importantly, the importance of a black agenda. Get ready, this one is going to be good. Right after the jump. Just answer this question whatever way you want to. When you hear the word grown man style, what comes to your mind? How would you define what does grown man style mean to you?
Grown man style to me means taking responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and it means being accountable to something,
Mm-hmm.
being accountable to your family, being accountable to your children, being accountable to society. And I think the challenge is that we've done in this era, we've done everything but that. I think it comes down to when we see things that are not um, enhancing the cause,
Mm-hmm.
we need to address it, but there's a way we address it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't blast it on social media. We don't uh, embarrass the person in public. But if there's something that needs to be addressed, we need to really go back to basics and have those sidebar conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I think one that shows respect, and I think that it also shows some form of integrity about us saying, I respect this person as a human being in order to coach them, but not to embarrass
Mm-hmm.
them. You mentioned something earlier in your conversation about, um, you know, what would I tell a young person?
Yep.
If I could tell a young person, or even tell myself,
Go back to your 15-year-old self.
I would tell that person, don't be afraid to be different.
Mm-hmm.
Be different. Be unique.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this cookie cutter approach to solving Black issues has essentially gotten us to where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the challenge is it's popular for everyone to think of but group think, excuse me, can be a very dangerous thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so if a person wants to be liberal or conservative, or if they want to uh, play chess instead of checkers, or if they want to travel the world, or if they want to go hiking or go camping, then my thoughts are do it. Be different. And
Mm-hmm.
as a Black community, we need to encourage it. We're stronger when we're more diverse in everything, all facets. I was reading something recently about um, Bayard Rustin, and how at the time, he was essentially the architect of the civil rights movement. And at the time, he was also he's one of the earliest LGBT openly cases in America in the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And even though uh, I've had my own personal convictions, but at the end of the day, this is a Black man who furthered the agenda, and he should be recognized,
Right.
regardless of what his past is. And I think, the LGBT community has always been an asset to the Black cause. The religious church community has always been an asset to the Black cause. So once again, we're seeing that theme that, when we don't benefit when all Blacks are liberal and Democrats, and none are on the Republican side. We need parties in both, and we need to go further than that. We need to have Blacks in the libertarian movement, and the socialist movement, and the Republican, and the Democrat, and the in the uh, green movement, the environment movement. When we have African Americans represented in all facets, it makes us a stronger community.
Would you say that is, would you agree with that if they are um, in that, but they're not necessarily serving our community, they're serving themselves? Does that negate what you said?
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that in, because I think on both sides that's been the challenge, And I always say this, I always rephrase the phrase, all skin ain't kin.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that is, how do we make sure that, and it comes back to an agenda. As Black people in America, we need an agenda that says, I don't care if you're gay, straight, old, young, male, female, Democrat, Republican, we've got to move the marker forward for our community. And so what does that look like? That looks like, an economic agenda. Number one, we've got to make sure that our people are not falling through the cracks of unemployment,
Mm-hmm.
that our people are not dealing with the issues and dynamics of just barely making it.
Mm-hmm.
That dog done hunt. The next thing is social. We have to make sure, and I believe in the big tent concept of America that says um, freedom, real freedom, is the ability to express yourself by any means necessary, as long as you are not harming other people. So when it becomes physical or an action, that's a different story. But people have a right to protest.
Mm-hmm.
People have a right. Now, keep in mind, I said protest. I didn't say destroy other people's property.
Right,
I
of
said
course.
protest.
Yep.
People have a right to be different. People have a right to dress different. People have the right to look different. That's the social experiment called America. And I think that what makes America great isn't what Donald Trump said. What makes America great is the fact that is the America that you can live in, where you can be you without persecution. You can practice whatever you want without persecution. You can say and be and live the way you want without persecution. That's real freedom.
Now, how about let's just say you or I grow up. Okay, yes, we're Black by skin color and ethnicity.
Sure.
But let's just say we go get educated. We live outside the community. We live an upstanding life. We don't give back to the community. We basically live our life independent of Black people, but we're doing well for ourselves. We're married, we're raising kids. Do we have an obligation to not give back to the community in any way without criticism? What do you think about that freedom? Is that freedom, or is that
Well, that's a different term. I wouldn't say that. I mean, the freedom is that you were free to get a quality education. You
mm-hmm,
were free to choose and pick where you want to live. Uh, that's a point of freedom and privilege. But I think you is getting back to the comment of agenda. Part of that agenda is making sure that there's a reach one, teach one approach. And
right?
so the village, this concept of the village, which I think we need to get back to, is the reality that says, if I grow and you don't, the village is broken,
Yep.
regardless of how I grow.
Yep.
And so even though we have freedom to pick, choose, get educated, date who we want, marry who we want, be with who we want, but if I'm doing successfully well and you are not, now keep in mind, there is free will, so you have the right to turn down help. But the point is the help being offered to you or being provided to you or for you?
Mm-hmm.
When that village is broken, then that does not help the agenda. So I go back to this concept of the agenda is, what does the agenda look like? How do we guarantee that regardless of who's in office or what they're running as or who they are as a person, they've got a mandate to fulfill that agenda?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just, you kind of see where I'm going with that, because you talk about freedom. We are free to love who we want to love, marry who we want to marry, but do we have the freedom to not support the agenda?
Well, we do, but that would also be like asking, do you have the freedom to not take care of your own health?
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the agenda and the freedom of supporting your community That's a part of spiritual health. And so there's, we have public health, we have medical health, we have spiritual health. There's also personal health.
Yeah.
And so I always say, I'm in the people engineering business. And, if you're growing and I'm not, then that's, and you know it like I know, that's the precipice of civil unrest.
So
That
where did you get that drive from? Did you get that from Howard? Did you get that from your family? Did you get that from church?
I
Where did
got
you
that.
get that?
I got that from my dad, and I'll tell you what happened. My dad was a police officer,
Mm-hmm.
retired, and I grew up in the southwest side of Detroit. So I didn't come up with money.
Mm-hmm.
My dad and my mom. My mom was an educated social worker who was also an officer. My dad was a police officer. We lived fairly moderate. We lived in the suburbs. I grew up in the suburbs. My cousins, and who I was extremely close to, lived in Southwest Detroit, and they lived on the east side. And so literally, I had the tale of two cities and the have-nots in my own personal family.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting is that my dad would literally go out, and when he bought me something, gifts, things of that nature, he would buy my cousins who did not have the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as a kid, I used to wonder, Dad, why do you buy them? They got parents.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad would always tell me, the point is, when they grow or when they achieve, when you get a gift, it's important that they get a gift. It's important because what it does, it levels out the playing field. And so part of that is that it's really that give back spirit. Like they say in Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility. And so my dad had the opportunity to have a great job and great career. Same with my mom. And so he used that as an opportunity to bless his siblings, to bless his nieces and nephews.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a grown man, you know, even though I am a conservative and I stand by a lot of my principles, but at the end of the day, I am the guy who's walking down the street with no food.
Mm-hmm.
I am the kid who's walking down the street with their pants sagging with no education, or who are suffering from illiteracy. I'm that guy. Even though I've had great accolades, I've had a great career, at the end of the day in America, I'm still that guy. And if I don't find it in my help to support those people, then everything else that I've strived for becomes irrelevant. And I think that's where blacks have to see it, is that no matter how wealthy you are in America, at the end of the day, this society still deems African Americans as less than, and that's the problem, and that's the reality.
Can
Sure.
you tell us what is a black conservative and what motivated you to join the Republican Party?
So I'll say this. So first of all, a majority of African Americans in this country subscribe to being conservative. Just by the way we vote, our lifestyles, etc. So let's put that to rest now.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I've heard that.
Conservatism is not old. I mean, it's still relevant.
Right.
The challenge is that I'm a conservative, but the challenge is that the question is, has our leadership, specifically our black leadership in the Republican Party, been as reflective as the community? And that's a big question mark.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is the principles are there, but is the conversation relevant to what we're talking about today? I'll give you an example. Republicans typically mean or support limited government. They support a stronger economy. They support the power of the individual as opposed to the government.
Mm-hmm.
For black people, it's a double-edged sword, because it's the government that allowed, rioting and lynching and racial profiling at the time in our history, and the oppressors. But it was also government that essentially challenged that oppression. So black people's relationship with government is very unique, because in a sense the government has been both for us and against us.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a very unique relationship with government. And so when you talk about conservative principles and you're talking about less government, depending on the group you're talking to, can be supportive or it can be totally against or not supportive.
Mm-hmm.
I became a conservative, and I always say that I'm a conservative because I don't think Black people in America are at a point where we can solely say I'm only going to vote for this type of person. It's really got to come down to the issues. What is the person talking about? How is this going to move? Once again, that word, the agenda forward.
Right.
I had an opportunity when I was very young to meet Colin Powell, and it changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
Because this was a Black man from Harlem who came up by his own bootstraps, but this was a Black man who understood the thought of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
There are some, just as even in the Democratic Party, but there are some Republicans who, in my opinion, have not made the Black agenda their cause. And it's almost delusional to think that in America has totally treated African Americans the same as our white counterparts. You know that's a lie, and I know that's a lie.
Right.
So if we're going to address it, let's address it, but let's address it in a constructive way that makes Black people, that gives Black people a real option on why they should support a certain cause or vote for a certain candidate and why not. And I think, unfortunately, the Democrats have painted a better picture. I don't agree with the policies, but they've painted a better social picture than Republicans have, at least in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I've got see if I have it here. A book. I know you're on your phone, so you may not be able to see, but the Reconstruction era, and a lot of people, young people, I should say, may not know that most African Americans were Republicans back then. Is that different than the current, base of Republican, or what do you know the difference between then and now in terms of party lines?
Well, I think obviously then were different days. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the most people who supported the Confederacy, and most people who, most of your hate groups and racial groups at that time identified as Dixiecrat Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Most Republicans advocated for, the abolitionist movement. They were really conservative drawn organizations that pushed that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that debate is played out. I mean, that's a debate that says, okay, the way people thought 100 years ago is a lot different than the way things are happening today.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do we make it relevant today?
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about issues like education,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll focus on that one because education is such an interesting topic, because in those days, or let's go back to the 60s, Little Rock, we couldn't get into the schools. They
Mm-hmm.
didn't want us there.
Right.
Now we can't get out of the schools. They want us stuck in there. So it's an interesting dynamic to say we couldn't get in. Now we can't get out of failing schools. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an issue that a conservative could really target and say, how do we put the emphasis back on kids, specifically Black kids? How do we talk about real issues like public safety and like poverty that are big factors in public school education? I am not for failing schools, but I do support those public schools that are making it. And I think we need to strengthen them and empower them like a cash tag.
Well, here's another tidbit that you may not know about me. Larry Patrick is in my family. That's uncle. I mean, I'm sorry, a cousin of mine, and wonderful guy. I miss him dearly. As you know, Larry was a Harvard-educated lawyer, a Republican, and he was an advocate for the charter schools,
Larry
which
ran
are.
me for school board.
What'd you say?
Larry ran me for school board.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I mean, everybody has a Larry Patrick story that is, serious about, education. And so
Right,
that's
right,
what triggered me to bring his name up. And I wasn't even thinking about that until you mentioned it. And now, Betsy DeVos seemed to have taken the charter school approach, and trying to take some of that, but it's coming under so much scrutiny, so it's kind of a difficult thing from an education standpoint, and that that unique agenda to really support. I don't know, you have any thoughts or opinion on that?
I do. Um, the charter school, and just so you know, my background is in I led charter school, or the movement on charter schools in New Jersey at one time, and so
Okay.
the charter school debate is an interesting one, because the problem that you have with charter schools is you've got money involved. Now let's put that as the factor.
Hmm.
Um, Charter schools are a mute solution, not the final solution. And so the challenge is, you don't put a charter school where there's already a school that is performing and competitive, because now that creates competition. And so charter schools were solely supposed to be utilized to replace failing school districts that was pretty blatant were failing.
Hmm.
And so the challenge is that one of the things that charter schools have not only become politicized, but I would go a step further and say the conversation on public education or charter education is that uh, society still does not give Black educators and administrators the full authority to govern and run their own schools, their own charter school networks.
Hmm.
Which is ironic, because you have historically Black colleges. So the mindset would be, if a person can run an HBCU, they should also be able to run a charter school.
Hmm.
And why is that important? That's important because when you talk about education, we educate our own very different than uh, our counterparts.
Hmm.
And so when you talk about education, you're talking about dealing with the issues of, or what are the issues with public education? First, property taxes is an issue. Taxes are an issue. Public safety is an issue. Poverty is an issue. Family disenfranchisement is an issue. And so the challenge with our schools is that we've got our kids dealing with a myriad of issues, so the point where when they get to school, they don't even have time to focus on learning, because they're dealing with issues that, in some cases, people 10 years above them are still not dealing with.
Hmm.
So there's a whole cadre around education. So I think with Betsy DeVos, the mistake that was made is it was too top down. And I
Hmm.
think if I had been the Secretary of Education, the better approach would have been to bring in those key stakeholders, local police departments, principals, educators, consultants, and talk about what is really happening in our public schools, and then how do we address it and fix it. I don't think that conversation has been had,
Wow.
and not only has it not been had, but then it plays into the narrative that charter schools are literally, there's this mindset, false mindset, but mindset, that charter schools are running the public schools out of business. And so I think there's a way that her office can utilize that through a grassroots effort to make sure that public education remains performing, but also making sure that charter schools reflect the community, and that some of the leadership of those charter schools look like the community.
Right. Well, the kind of back to the Republican Democrat thing, because you mentioned what the influence that your father had about helping others, and then the same thing, you and I are in the same men's Bible study class every Tuesday, and so then there's the Christianity influence. Me, who I typically vote Democratic, but just philosophically, when I listen to what the Democrats say, a lot of it, and what the Republicans criticize is they want to help other people. So obviously, our tax base should Republicans say our tax base should focus on we want to reduce the size of government, whereas
Right.
Democrats are like, we want to help people. If we have 10 pieces of chicken, we want to, it's okay to give. Our Christianity teaches us it's okay, and what your father taught you, it's okay to give other people so that they can have what we have. I'm going to be good, and it's going to help me if I know that my money is going to help other people. That's in alignment with my values and what I'm taught at church and what your
Sure.
father taught you. What's your thoughts on that?
I am a believer in the power of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I think the government, which is going back to that self-serving piece,
Mm-hmm.
I think the government is made up of people. The challenge is that government is made up of people with their own personal interests, not the interests of the masses. And so I've
On
always
both
said,
sides, absolutely.
on both sides. And so I've always said that government should play less of a role, but what we need to do is strengthen the private sector so that we create more. I mean, instead of government giving out the chicken, I want government to create the atmosphere where you can start a chicken joint and I can go directly to you.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's empowering individuals, and I think that has not been a message. That is the message of the Republican movement, of the conservative movement at least, but that has not been the message of what we're seeing in our politics today. That really gets into how do we make government less, and how do we give the community and the overall masses more. Privatization is another topic that people typically will talk about. Subcontract agreements is another. And so the challenge is that I'm all for privatization and subcontract agreements. The problem is you and I are not part of that conversation. And
Right.
so it's, if I want to start a school building or if I want to start a business and I'm talking about privatizing and doing, getting off the books and allowing for someone else to do it for cheaper and better, and I give that contract, part of that contract has to be people laying the floors, fixing the toilets, doing the windows. And the challenge is we are not a part of that conversation. And so the problem with less government is that I support enhancing the private sector and enhancing minority small business owners.
Mm-hmm.
But then the question is, how do we get in the game? And we get in the game through subcontract agreements. That has to be a priority. Otherwise, either way it goes, you and I don't benefit.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about closing that achievement gap, there's issues with the family. You know, everybody doesn't have the great parents that you had and that I had that helped us become the men we are. Everybody won't get a chance to go to a Howard or a Morehouse. And even if they try to go to Michigan, they're not able to identify as, I'm not going to use the word minority because you know what's up with that. We are not minorities.
Right, we're not.
but anyway, the point of equity to try to get us into the types of schools and where we can get education so that we can do for ourselves. The Republicans seem to always be wanting to take a lot of that stuff away to give us the subcontracts. They want to take out the quota to say, hey, 25% or 10% has to go to minority or Black-owned businesses. They want to take those types of things out. And so it's going to set us back. And so that's one of the key. I absolutely agree. I mean, if Tulsa taught us anything, it'd be wonderful if we owned the whole block and we had our own, aspects of that. Tulsa existed before Elijah Muhammad said, hey, let's just separate and do our own, have our own farms, have our own, aspects. So I get what you're saying, and I agree that will be wonderful. Integration may have screwed it up for all of us.
You bring up a great point of why it's important to have Black conservatives in the room who subscribe to the agenda. I go back to that agenda piece. Yeah. I go back to that agenda piece because when the deal is being made at the table and the contract is being given out, it's up to us, FUBU, for us, by us. It's up to us to say, hey, how many blacks are going to get an opportunity to bid for this contract? The problem is we ain't talking. That's the problem. It's time to talk. And the challenge is we become demonized because we're not subscribing to the masses that says we don't subscribe to the conservative ideology. No, we have to we have to be strategic. Life at this point is about strategy. And we've got to say, how do we get more blacks to bid for the contracts, to know when the contract is being offered, to get collateral, to get bonded. See, if we don't know this stuff, then we'll never know how to play in this game called America. Yeah. And so the black agenda is no different than many folks in the Jewish community and the Arab American community, but it's how do we make sure that by any means necessary, we win. And that's a sensitive conversation. That's a very sensitive conversation.
Well, it is, because one of the first things you said is that we don't have an agenda.
You said something really interesting. There's an assumption that if you are conservative, you aren't black enough. And the challenge with that is, I think that's not only I think it's a disclaimer, it's a false narrative, because especially now, being a African American conservative, I say you're almost more militant because you're dealing with blacks who don't trust you, and whites who, in some cases, in some places, don't want you there in the first place. So you've got a double whammy of the type of issues that you deal with when you're talking about how do we fix Black America. And I tell people in a heartbeat, if it's the right Black Democrat or liberal who's talking about empowering the community, I'm gonna support that brother. Because at the end of the day, this is business. This is about strategy. This is how do we move our generation forward. And we have to do this. Otherwise, it's gonna be very difficult. It's gonna be very difficult.
Well, yeah, and one of the other things that doesn't help the cause of when you get into certain levels, especially on the Republican side, but just in politics in general, both sides of the aisle, when you get propelled and elevated to a certain point, there's some things that's going on that we don't necessarily know about. The lobbyists control so many different things, and then the money and the financial backing and the sort of the you're not supposed quid pro quos are shunned upon. But if somebody's donating $50,000 to some campaign, I'm just making that number up, something might come in. They might expect something in return. I know it's not legal per se, but lobbyists are there for a reason. They're there to push certain agendas or block certain things from happening. And it's hard to say, not to say people are getting paid off, but there's ways of doing that. And then there's the lobbyists trying to push things or block certain things. I mean, and let me give you a quick example. We're talking about a lot of the protests going on right now, black men and women getting killed by police. And we're trying to get some changes going on. White kids are being killed through these mass shootings in schools. And white people, of course, are enraged, and they want to have changes, but those changes are not happening. Why? Because of the gun lobbyists. Okay, so if whites are not successful in getting changes for their own kids being killed, how can we be confident that changes are going to be made for our kids getting killed because of the same type of things that's blocking?
So that's an interesting point, because I actually just talked on this one of the things that we've got to challenge is not only the fact that police unions have a responsibility, and we should demand this, that officers who have a history of misconduct should not be on the police force.
Absolutely.
Period.
Absolutely.
But the other side to that is, are we questioning how many blacks are actually on the police force?
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a question where I think, the good thing out of what's happened is that I think more black people in America are starting to ask the questions of where are we?
Mm-hmm.
There's a board, I won't put the name out there, but there's a board that they asked me to serve on. And I go to the website, and I'm a conservative, but I notice wasn't no blacks.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I did, I go to the guy and I said, hey, I appreciate you. I look forward to serving on this board, but how do we increase the number of diversity in this organization?
Mm-hmm.
I'm making it my responsibility to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, and I think that needs to be the mindset. You want to talk about how does the agenda start? With people like me and you, who say, hey, there's no blacks on this board. There's no blacks in this organization. There's no blacks on this committee. And if they can't find one, I'll help provide one for you.
Right.
And that has to be the mindset. We can't fall in the rhetoric that our counterparts say, well, they haven't applied.
Mm-hmm.
We got to make it our responsibility to bring them to the table. And I think that is a start of how do we fix this issue. I remember years ago, I heard Justice Thomas at one time mention. I want to be careful because it was at an event in D.C. And as somebody who filled the shoes of Clarence Thomas of
Thurgood or
Thurgood Marshall,
yeah,
I said it's not enough to just be a Supreme Court justice and have the honor of serving in that role as an African American, but it should have been his duty to go down the street to Howard University Law School and find someone. And I think that has to be the mindset of black conservatives or black Republicans in their roles, is how do we make it our business to prepare the next generation of black leadership, not just hope that it happens.
Right, exactly. I agree. And like I said, we're not monolithic. We don't necessarily think the same. And it's just, I'm able to have this conversation with you. And it's not just, we both from Detroit. We both grew up with good families. We both are obviously, Christian and driven by our faith. We have a lot in common. And, but there are certain things that are blocking the progress, like the police unions, who donate a lot of money to these lobbyists who support blocking things like what you mentioned, such as making people's demerits and written, when they get written up, making that public knowledge, So, but didn't Trump, or did the president sign an executive order making that public knowledge, or did I not understand that right?
I think you did. I know that's been a conversation with the police reform bill that Senator Tim Scott is working on. And, I think this is why, first of all, the fact that Senator Tim Scott, I believe there's 3 or 4 African-American U.S. senators. That's a problem.
Tim is probably not the most popular one, but I understand.
And Tim Scott is the only black Republican senator.
Correct.
Keep in mind, there are 100 senators and there are 435 congressmen. I'm gonna read those numbers again. 435, technically 535, and there are 3 black U.S. senators and 1 black Republican senator. We got some work to do. I saw a film that changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
It was a documentary on the Black Godfather. Have you seen it?
Absolutely. Avant, yes. Never
And
heard of
one
the
of the
guy.
and one of the things that amazed me about this man is he understood the bottom line.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is it's important that we have somebody in that room that not only makes sure we get paid, but also make sure we don't get played.
Yeah.
And I think that that is where we need to be in politics. I've tried to be this person, but I think we have to have people in the room that can have the conversation when we are there with our counterparts,
Mm-hmm.
and then can have the personal conversation when we are not in the room with our counterparts. Once again, that's part of what I said, the agenda.
Yeah. And if we can get the athletes onto this agenda,
Oh man,
if we
it's the
can get
corporate,
the
the black folks on Wall
HBCUs,
Street, HBCUs. I mean, we have an opportunity to be something powerful, but we gotta be big enough to put our differences aside.
right?
So that means I don't care if you're a socialist, if you are a part of the LGBT community, if you are a radical, if you are a conservative, if you're a Trump supporter, if you're a Biden supporter, at the end of the day, the commonality is that you black.
Well, let me ask you this. Would this be a public agenda or a private agenda? Because the other documentary I watched, which I would highly recommend, is "And Still I Rise," the Maya Angelou, and Malcolm spent a lot of time with her when he was in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
he was going to bring up, to the United Nations, and he was trying to rally the African leaders, but they couldn't support him because they were all getting paid by the American government. Not all, but
I'm gonna say this to you, and this is how I've always operated. The more secret you are, the more
Mhm.
powerful you are.
Well, right, but the
And
more
I'll leave it
secret
there.
you are, and when that power the the powers that be are going to infiltrate and try and divide. And so
Well,
that's the
yeah, yeah. That goes back to the all skin ain't kin. Part of the
yeah.
agenda is being able to. One thing. If you had to say, what's the one issue that affects you and my people, affects our community, is trust.
Yeah.
If we
Yeah.
can get that trust thing down, we can do some amazing things for our communities, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey man, I'm gonna give you the final word. I mean, like I said, we want to help young people watching this, and we talked about education, we talked about the parents, and any last words you want to say about you know telling your 15-year-old self or a young brother coming up?
What I would tell my young self and any young person is, don't be afraid to be different.
Yeah.
Question everything and never let a question go unanswered.
Hmm.
And I think that part of how we fix society is by investing in our young people.
Hmm.
Exposure and opportunity are the two things that are going to change the black community for the future. And then lastly, I think technology is something that we can use as a vessel to get this agenda out to our people. When I read about Juneteenth and how literally you had blacks throughout the nation that didn't know they were free.
For
I
two
mean,
years.
that's amazing to me. They didn't have Facebook back then.
Right.
And so now I think the question is, how do we use technology not to put money in Bill Gates's pocket or Jeff Bezos' pocket, but use technology as a global tool to bring this agenda to pass where 10 solid action items can occur. And
Hmm.
that's making sure our people are employed, our people have access to quality education, our people have access to quality education, healthcare, making sure that our people um, understand the market and the
Hmm.
financial system is extremely important, financial literacy. and then making sure that our families are staying intact, and making sure that part of family is making sure that each person identifies as this being a community. Because when you have your family, you treat them different. You don't blast them on social media. You don't expose them and try to ruin their careers. But instead, it's the fact that I'm looking out for you, and I expect you to look out for me. That's a part of the family that we can build, and that should be the main nucleus of this thing called the agenda.
And that trust is it's going to take time to build true, real trust, because it took a long time for that trust to go away. And there are a lot of factors inside and outside of our control and influence that basically killed that trust factor.
Because the challenge that I've seen, we're black, we're black, we're walking in a room black, but don't nobody know what each other needs.
Right.
That's all we need to do. That's the start of this thing called the agenda. How can I help you? And how can you help me?